There is a reason people less capable than you command more respect, not because the world is unfair, but because you are still playing fair inside a game designed by people who abandoned fairness long ago. And until you understand the real mechanics of power, every quality you consider a virtue will continue to be quietly used against you. At some point, you begin to notice a pattern you can no longer ignore. The people trying hardest to be fair are often tested the most. Those who avoid conflict eventually carry its consequences, and those searching for balance slowly discover something unsettling. Balance is rarely mutual. At first, you call it bad luck. Then you assume you simply encountered the wrong people. Only later does a more uncomfortable realization begin to form. The problem was never who others were. The problem was the game you were playing. You were taught that the world operates through moral reciprocity. Be reasonable, and others will be reasonable. Be loyal, and loyalty will return. Show goodwill, and it will be recognized. This belief feels natural because it is deeply human, biologically ingrained. For your ancestors, social acceptance meant survival. Exclusion meant vulnerability. So the human mind evolved to reduce tension, preserve harmony, and avoid confrontation, even when the personal cost quietly increased. But modern society does not function like a small tribe. It functions as a network of interests. Machiavelli observed this without outrage, without moral judgment. Men are ungrateful, fickle, deceptive, fearful of danger, and greedy for gain. He was not condemning humanity, he was describing operational reality. If people pursue advantage, behavior inevitably moves toward the lowest risk and the greatest reward. From this emerges the first lesson: never assume loyalty, observe interest. Loyalty is rarely permanent. It is a temporary response to circumstance. As long as interaction with you provides benefit without consequence, stability appears genuine. The moment advantage shifts, behavior shifts with it. Not because people suddenly become immoral, but because their decision systems prioritize safety and gain above declared principles. The real danger appears when your social strategy ignores this mechanism, when you continue investing based on presumed character instead of visible incentives shaping behavior. Machiavelli warned that a prudent ruler must rely on what lies within his control, not on what depends upon others, which leads inevitably to the second lesson. Do not ask for respect. Create consequence. Most people attempt correction through explanation, long conversations, emotional clarification, appeals to fairness. Yet repeated explanation sends a silent message. Your boundary exists only if others choose to honor it. The human mind quickly learns where no real cost exists. If crossing a line produces discussion, behavior continues. If it produces loss of access, opportunity, or influence, behavior adjusts immediately. Power rarely disappears through conflict. It disappears through tolerated repetition. Here appears one of Machiavelli's most misunderstood insights. It is safer to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. This was never an endorsement of cruelty. It was an observation about stability. Affection depends on emotion. Emotion fluctuates. Respect grounded in consequence depends on calculation, and calculation remains constant. This becomes the third lesson. Stop pursuing approval. Become predictable in response. People do not need to like you to respect you. They only need certainty about outcomes. Once your reactions become consistent, testing gradually stops. Yet most people make the same mistake. After long tolerance, they react suddenly, emotionally, loudly, attempting to reclaim authority overnight. But instability never creates authority. Machiavelli understood this clearly. Injuries should be inflicted all at once, while benefits should be granted gradually, which reveals the fourth lesson. Do not warn repeatedly. Intervene rarely and decisively. Repeated warnings train others to ignore you. A calm, final correction creates social memory. People rarely respect speeches about values. They respect immediate changes in cost. At this point, transformation begins internally. You realize many frustrations were never caused by hostility, but by ambiguity. Patience was mistaken for permission. Kindness was interpreted as permanent availability, and the world responded logically. As understanding grows, emotional reaction slows. A pause appears between stimulus and response. Within that pause, analysis replaces impulse. You begin noticing tests before they become conflicts, subtle shifts before they solidify into patterns, and gradually, choice replaces reaction. Sometimes you correct, sometimes you ignore strategically, sometimes you withdraw access without explanation. Each decision reshapes the structure quietly, without drama. Machiavelli understood that true authority does not require constant demonstration. Eventually, it becomes assumed. And once authority is assumed, conflict becomes inefficient. If a quiet discomfort appears now, it is expected. Part of you still prefers the illusion of universal harmony, but clarity does not provide comfort, it provides control. And if past experiences suddenly begin to make sense, mark that moment, not for validation, but for awareness. A like is not applause, it is acknowledgement that you choose clarity over reflex. And if you choose to continue, stay, subscribe. Because from this point forward, the lessons grow darker. We are no longer speaking about boundaries, we are speaking about control of the frame. In reality, most people do not lose position in dramatic moments. There is no single confrontation where everything changes. Loss appears slowly, almost invisibly, through repeated small concessions, through moments where correction is avoided to escape discomfort, through choices favoring immediate peace over long-term stability. And the human mind registers these concessions, even when no one speaks about them openly. Every tolerated boundary becomes precedent. Every precedent becomes permission. Every permission quietly alters your position without open conflict. Machiavelli understood that order is rarely destroyed by one decisive blow, but by the accumulation of small ignored weaknesses. That is why disorder must be prevented before it becomes visible. Once obvious, correction becomes exponentially costly. People do not react only to the present, they react to the pattern you allowed. And here a colder realization emerges. Respect is not lost when someone challenges you. Respect is lost when that challenge changes nothing. At that moment, social behavior reveals itself as unconscious testing, not malicious, not planned, instinctive. Each person attempts to discover where real limits exist so they can adjust safely within them. When boundaries are unclear, testing continues. When boundaries are stable, testing stops. This marks the invisible transition between someone perceived as available and someone perceived as stable. Excessive availability invites demand. Stability reduces demand before it is even expressed. And without noticing the exact moment, you begin speaking less, not from withdrawal, but from precision. You stop explaining every decision, stop correcting every misunderstanding. You intervene only where reality changes, not opinion. Because Machiavelli understood something most discover too late. People are not convinced by arguments, but by repeated outcomes. And when outcomes become consistent, explanations become unnecessary. At that point, your silence begins to weigh more than the words of others, and this is the first real shift of power. After you understand that respect is not granted morally, but calculated strategically, a more uncomfortable stage begins, because you realize that personal boundaries alone are not enough. You may have clear rules, consistent behavior, even discipline, and still lose position if someone else controls how reality itself is interpreted. This is where most people remain trapped. They believe truth defends itself. They believe facts clarify situations. They assume fairness eventually prevails. But Machiavelli observed something very different while studying political conflict. Men judge more by appearances than by reality. And from this emerges the next lesson. It is not enough to be right. You must control how rightness is perceived. Within any group, the person who defines the situation controls the reaction to it. If someone successfully frames you as rigid, difficult, or excessive before you even speak, you will inevitably begin defending yourself. And defense instantly transfers power to the accuser, because long explanations create the impression of guilt. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must appear virtuous even when circumstances require actions that are not. He was not recommending hypocrisy. He was acknowledging a simple psychological fact. Most people never investigate character deeply. They respond to image, which leads to the fifth lesson. Control perception before others construct it for you. Not through deception, but through selection, through what you reveal and what you deliberately leave unexplained. Total transparency does not create trust. It creates predictable vulnerability. The more precisely others understand what affects you, the easier it becomes for them to adjust behavior in their favor. Discretion becomes strategic protection. As you begin applying this principle, another invisible mechanism becomes clear. Conversations are rarely exchanges of ideas. They are negotiations of position. The person who speaks more often justifies. The person who ends the conversation defines the frame. Machiavelli understood that authority does not manifest through endless argument, but through the ability to decide when discussion ends. A weak leader explains continuously. A stable one determines when explanation is finished. This introduces the sixth lesson. Do not win arguments. Control when arguments stop. A calm sentence delivered at the correct moment carries more influence than flawless logic extended too long. People rarely remember complete reasoning. They remember who remained composed when tension increased. And here the tone darkens. You begin noticing that many individuals are not searching for truth in conversation. They are searching for emotional advantage. They raise their voice, introduce urgency, or apply social pressure to provoke impulsive reaction. The moment you react emotionally, the terrain has already shifted. Machiavelli warned that a ruler must avoid contempt even more carefully than open hostility. Contempt appears when you are perceived as unstable or easily provoked. Thus emerges the seventh lesson. Do not grant direct access to your emotional reactions. This does not mean suppression, it means delay. A space appears between stimulus and response. Within that space, control returns to you. Others can no longer predict the effect they will have. Emotional unpredictability creates caution. When people cannot calculate your reaction, risk increases. And when risk increases, behavior adjusts naturally, without confrontation, without declarations, without visible struggle. Then another realization follows. Not every battle deserves victory. Machiavelli observed that a wise ruler avoids unnecessary conflicts, not from weakness, but from strategic economy. Attention is limited. Energy is limited. Authority erodes when spent responding to every minor provocation, which becomes the eighth lesson. Choose conflicts that reshape structure, not ego. Some provocations exist only to pull you into inferior games. You ignore them deliberately. Others, however, alter collective perception. Those require swift and precise intervention. This selectivity creates psychological gravity. Gravity does not come from aggression, it comes from rarity. The less frequently you react, the more significant each reaction becomes. Over time, something subtle changes in the behavior around you. Constant correction becomes unnecessary. People adjust before intervention is required, not because morality improved, because structure became clear. And gradually, your position stops depending on explanation. It depends on reputation. Machiavelli considered reputation one of the most powerful instruments of power, precisely because it operates even in your absence. A reputation for consistency prevents conflict before it forms. Authority begins working without your presence. If this stage feels uncomfortable, that reaction is natural. Because here you abandon the belief that spontaneous harmony sustains relationships. You begin understanding that structure sustains harmony, not the reverse. And if you have reached this point without searching for emotional reassurance, acknowledge it quietly. Not for validation, but for continuity. A like does not change these principles, but it marks your decision to observe mechanisms without the filter of comfort. And if you intend to continue, remain. Subscribe. Because the final stage no longer concerns interaction, it concerns inevitability. Something fundamental begins to shift now, not in the behavior of others, that was always predictable, but in how you perceive the movement of power itself. You start noticing that most people live reactively, responding to circumstances without understanding who shapes those circumstances in the first place. And here appears the final distinction between those who play the game and those who become part of its structure. Machiavelli wrote that people believe they control events, while in reality events control those who fail to anticipate change. He compared political disorder to illness, difficult to recognize early but easy to cure, obvious later but nearly impossible to correct without severe cost. From this emerges the ninth lesson. Do not react to loss of power. Detect it before it becomes visible. Respect rarely disappears suddenly. It erodes gradually. Tone shifts slightly. Priority changes subtly. Negotiations appear where none existed before. Most ignore these signals because they seem insignificant, but small deviations define future structure. Correction applied early requires little force. Correction delayed demands conflict. Mature power prevents rather than repairs. As this awareness develops, another insight emerges. Events matter less than interpretation. Two individuals may perform identical actions and be perceived entirely differently. Machiavelli wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few understand what you truly are. Which introduces the 10th lesson. Control the narrative before the narrative controls you. Not every truth requires explanation. Not every accusation deserves rebuttal. Excessive defense signals uncertainty. Brief clarification establishes reality. When you calmly define the meaning of a situation, most people adopt that interpretation without investigation, not from ignorance, but from cognitive economy. People prefer perceptual stability. You begin understanding why reputation surpasses direct force. Force requires constant application. Reputation operates independently. When people believe certain boundaries cannot be crossed, attempts become rare. Conflict dissolves before beginning. And then comes the darkest transition. You realize your access itself is a resource. Most people distribute time, attention, and availability freely, believing proximity creates security. Yet Machiavelli observed that excessive familiarity inevitably breeds loss of respect, not because others become hostile, but because absence of rarity eliminates value. This becomes the 11th lesson. Control access to yourself, not through isolation, but selection. You do not respond instantly to every request. You are not permanently available. You do not explain every personal decision. Rarity creates psychological weight. What is not constantly accessible becomes carefully evaluated. And finally, the last lesson, the one Machiavelli presents not morally, but inevitably. Fortune governs only part of life. The rest belongs to those capable of decisive action when opportunity appears. Most people wait for certainty before acting. Those who understand power create certainty through action. This is the 12th lesson. Do not wait for the right moment. Become the force that creates it. At this stage, reaction fades. Social dynamics no longer dictate behavior. Instead, environments begin adjusting around you. And paradoxically, no excitement appears, only quiet. Because emotions that once dictated behavior, the need for validation, anger, the desire for the final word, lose relevance. You recognize that most conflicts were never about truth. They were negotiations of position. You no longer need to win every discussion, no longer feel compelled to demonstrate superiority. You choose rarely, intervene precisely, continue without explanation. Authentic power becomes nearly invisible. People adjust before correction becomes necessary. Tones soften, tests disappear, not because fear is declared, but because structure is understood. And here you arrive at what Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago. The world does not belong to the most moral, nor to the most intelligent. It belongs to those who understand human nature without illusion. If you reach this point, you likely feel no excitement. That is correct. Real understanding does not produce euphoria. It produces weight, silence, distance from reactions that once felt unavoidable. If this clarity has made you quieter, acknowledge it, not for approval, but recognition. A like does not change these lessons, but it confirms your decision to stop playing naively. And if you choose to remain in this state of awareness, subscribe, not for promises, but continuity. Because once structure becomes visible, ignorance is no longer available. And from that moment forward, the game does not become easier, it becomes predictable.